Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Jason Littlefield. He is the Executive Director of Empowered Pathways and a co-founder of Free Black Thought. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank y'all for having me.
So we have a lot of gurus on a lot of topics, and you are the SEL guru. So I wanted to talk about that leg of the crazy tripod in the schools. And you have a lot of interesting things. I've seen some of the things you wrote and listened to some of your interviews, and it's very insightful. So I know I'm going to learn a lot, but some of us are playing catch up. So you're going to need to catch us up too. So don't jump right in on the fifth floor and tell me about how bad transformative SEL is. Explain to us just what SEL is, right?
Okay.
And so let's start off there with what's good about it or why they started to implement it in the schools.
All right, I heard a couple of different questions, so I'll jump into all of them. So
Okay.
People may be familiar with things like emotional intelligence or character education, soft skills, some of those types of words. Essentially, that's kind of what SEL is. And also something to think about is that human beings are essentially social and emotional creatures. So we're always emoting, feeling, thinking, forming relationships. So SEL is around that. And how it first was presented, there are 5 competencies to develop self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision-making skills. So all of those are really good things that we would want to develop. Right? With me so far?
Yes.
Okay. So the national organization around SEL is CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. They kind of set the norm and set the standard for what K-12 does with social and emotional learning. And I was a SEL specialist in Austin, Texas, from 2014 to 2021. And around 2017, 2018, I started to notice the ideological shift in the materials that were coming into the workplace and into the trainings that I was attending and to the trainings that I was having to facilitate. It was a whole brand new set of ideology, and I recognized it because I was a history teacher and a history major, and I've seen these patterns before. And then by 2020, it completely shifted into that transformative SEL.
So you said you started to see materials change, but I'm still trying to get an understanding of what they were. So as an SEL specialist in Austin in 2015, so before, I mean, it probably was starting to move in that direction before it really got bad. How was it being implemented in the schools? So was it, especially at the lower ages, was it
right
a coursework? Was it a section of the day? Was it a lesson plan? Or was it just something that they incorporated?
It all depends on the campus and how they wanted to utilize it. A lot of, especially at the lower age, they would have, maybe 30 minutes a day were devoted, to developing a SEL skill, doing a lesson. Even sometimes in middle school and high school, take time out to develop, how do we develop self-awareness? And maybe doing some meditation practices, building community, building relationships with each other, those types of things. In 2015, we were talking about growth mindset and resilience perseverance, those types of SEL skills. And then when it shifted to more of the collectivist philosophy, we stopped developing the individual.
Right, right. Shamika or Will, do you have any comments or questions on the initial stages of the SEL?
I have a question. So I heard you mention like soft skills. I do think that's a term that I've actually heard and maybe a little familiar with. I'm wondering when exactly they started implementing these in schools. I know you were a teacher of it in 2014. What exactly does it look like in the school or in the classroom? Is it a subject? Is it just like, what is it? Were you teaching another subject and then, put these things in there? Like, how does that work?
All of the above. And I want to touch on the kind of confusion, like what is it that everybody seems to kind of face? I think a lot of that is intentional, that it is kind of this nebulous thing, but it's also, as a teacher, how do I connect with my students? How do I manage my own emotions? Like if I'm about to get really pissed, what can I do to not get really pissed and to cause a relationship split with my colleague or a student? So really it's just kind of, it could be how we navigate through the world. Like some teachers stand outside of their classrooms, welcoming their students, come on in, doing the high fives, different things like that. How do we, just kind of engaging those positive emotions, so everybody to kind of get because it gets the brain ready to learn.
Right.
It's not in that fight or flight stage. It's like, okay, this is an environment that I can hang out and learn and thrive in.
Okay, gotcha.
So weren't they doing that already? In varying ways, weren't they coming up with ways to empower you, ways for processes for conflict resolution,
Yes.
things of that nature? It's like, that's not new, right? It didn't have a label. So
Right.
They were doing it, different practices, but they were doing that in school before, right? So what was the push, or what did they think they were going to fix by saying, we're going to carve out an SEL program, label it something, SEL, and implement it that way?
That I don't know, especially seeing the turn that it took, because it really didn't get into schools. Let's say 2013, Castle had 7 initial districts around the nation, and Austin was one of them. I joined the following year. So really, 2015, 2016, 2017, it kind of kicked off and is embedded in through K-12 system. And then 2020 is a dramatic shift. Once it's completely in the system, that's when they replaced the philosophy and practices to this. And really the reason why I started, kind of calling attention to the culture and speaking out was because I noticed that the way that society is structured right now is having a negative impact on our social emotional well-being.
Right.
Just look around, watch the news, look how relationships are being destroyed, look how all of this is happening, and it is the dehumanization caused by this new ideology.
And then lastly, you were trained. So now that it's in so many more schools and it's taken a turn, but were they even training enough people specifically for this? So it's in the schools. Is it something every teacher? You got to the point that you were training people, but is it every teacher, or are teachers expected to do this stuff based on a little bit of training they get from someone who has specialized training like yourself, but it's not really training to the level that they would need in order to implement it properly?
Right. In order to, and and when we say it looks 1,000 different ways. Like I've developed an SEL framework, and what my work looks like is completely different from what is happening across the nation. I don't prescribe a one-size-fits-all fix, and it's also not Marxist.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what exactly is the goal? Like, is it just to help people be a little, like kids be a little more social, or is it to make them care or think about certain things the way you or maybe other teachers, SEL teachers, think and feel about certain things? Like
empathy is pushed, stressing like, we're teaching empathy, we're teaching perspective taking. Those are some of the things those are the claims that are made. But what I've discovered is that we're not teaching perspective taking, because I had a perspective in my local working group. My perspective was from a classical liberal, and I noticed that this was collectivist political ideology. And I said, this is something that we should probably talk about. And that perspective was most definitely not welcome. So, and it wasn't part of the inclusion. So all of these words, inclusion, compassion, empathy, when they're being told through that new framework, they're inaccurate descriptions. They're inauthentic.
If I could jump in for a second here, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this, especially listening to sort of Shamika's questions there about softer skills, it sounds like you were a good instructor in this. Hearing you break it down, hearing you explain it does, but this doesn't sound like it has a damn thing to do with education. I mean, this sounds like it's training almost in how to be nice.
right.
Like the EQ training I went through as a young executive, like how to be polite to people you're trying to hustle on the phone for a package of bonds or whatever. I mean, you don't mean to be too glib. I mean, there's an old line in the sales business, sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. But this seems to be the same kind of training, how to be or appear compassionate, how to increase your empathy, perhaps especially as a young male, how to communicate. So I guess my first question for you, Jason, would be, how'd this get into the schools? Again, it sounds like in addition to being a very solid teacher, you were good at teaching this. But what was the impetus behind SEL? And I guess another question is, was this ever graded? Were we giving people scores based on their level of kindness?
I think some places have tried to evaluate that. I have always firmly said there is no way another imperfect human being should be evaluating another imperfect human being on these skills. How did it get into schools? I would say money, and I'm curious about what this new agenda is, and all of that. How does it belong in schools? Why does it belong in schools? I'll use my framework, for example, because as you said, it sounds like we're trying to get people to be nice, and there's this kind of confusion around it, and it's just kind of mumbo jumbo. But what I've discovered is that how we navigate the world, how we respond to what's in front of us, what's down the road, all of those things determine our ultimate success and well-being. So I started working on a different framework, and I came up with 6 different attitudes and practices that if we are able to focus on those 6 practices day in and day out and in the moment, then we will be more resilient. And for example, one of those attitudes is to develop a value-centered identity, where you choose, every individual chooses, and I go through this in my workshop, but there's a long value list, and I have people, we select what are your personal values, and how do I guide my life? How do I guide my personal behavior in accordance with my values? So how can I be true to myself all the time, rather than my identity is shaped by what society tells me my skin color or what gender or one of those things, one of those stereotype categories. So how do I lead from a value-centered identity? And also, how do I practice seeing somebody else as I see myself? Because, go, Shamika.
Shamika?
Well, I was just wondering, like, seeing somebody else, myself, how do you teach empathy? Like, suppose I was a child and there was a fat girl who couldn't completely fit in her desk. And I didn't feel sorry for her. Like, how or even why would I need to have empathy? Like, I'm just, you know.
No, it may be spicy or wrong to say, do you have to have empathy? But the thing, I mean, I guess technically nobody really has to have empathy. However, I believe that one of the keys to living and maintaining a free society is having a compassionate public that will look out for each other, that will, when we see somebody in need, lend a hand, and we've all laughed
Like
at and done
stuffing
things.
her in the desk, like trying to help push her into the desk that she couldn't fit in. Would that be like lending a helping hand? Would that be seen as empathy? I'm just wondering.
It just depends on where your heart's at in that moment.
Okay.
Are you like, oh man, I need to help this girl, or are you trying to crack everybody up by drawing attention to it? I don't know what's in your mind and heart.
So y'all don't judge kids based on that?
No.
Okay.
And you get graded on that, and right now you're failing.
And in fact, so speaking of judgment and SEL, another one of the tools, the attitudes that I try to cultivate is how do we disrupt those thoughts of judgment and fear and replace them with inquiry and compassion. So how do we in the moment when we have those judgmental or fearful thoughts that do divide us from each other, how can I in that moment replace that with inquiry and compassion?
Okay, Jason, this is awesome. See, this is what I mean. We're going to get to the back end where you're going to tear apart how they bastardize what good is from it. But I told you, I'm learning this stuff, and I'm still trying to gain. I see the positive. I'm not saying I don't see any positive, but gain in the whole. If you look at the whole process and everything that the schools are there to do, and you got to keep in mind from us, people like Shamika and I can't really speak for Will, but the people like us who this is new to us and we're trying to understand it. It's not that we're poo-pooing it, but it's kind of like we see what's going on in schools. So we know what the general purpose of the school is, and we know they're failing at it, right? So even before I get to how bad they made it, I'm wondering with the time and the effort and the struggle that they're going through and how people aren't reading and doing math at grade level, how them trying to just take a section of the day out to make good people would even be beneficial if the offset of that is kids who can't read and write. But beyond that, we know who the people were and what their ideology is. So even if it wasn't so blatant that it's in all the prepared works, but they're going to define doing these things through their lens, even if no one had hijacked SEL, the teachers in the classroom are still, let's be real, young white women. So the young white women are still going to come with their young white liberal experience, right? Give you an example. My kid was 4 at the time, I want to say, and they said 5, and they said we're going to start teaching STEM in the early grades, pre-K and K. Yay, right? We all know what STEM is. STEM. His first lesson, I always talked about before about women in STEM because women have been marginalized, but I never really talk about the second lesson. The second lesson in STEM class was about empathy. And so he was supposed to interview an adult about empathy, and the teachers gave them examples. So the example was, I have a friend who is a coder at Google. So I interviewed my friend who's a coder at Google. And I asked her, as a woman coder, what is it like working at Google? Well, as a woman coder, sometimes I feel bad because I'm often the only woman in the section or in the conference room. You know, I feel kind of left out. So I joined a group of women coders so I can feel, you know, a sense of belonging, only to find out that all these women coders were pushing everyone to be entrepreneurs. And I didn't want to be an entrepreneur. I just wanted to be a coder. And that made me feel bad. So I felt bad being the only woman coder, but then I felt bad when I joined the other woman. He's 5. This was the STEM class. This was STEM class, and he's 5. And this Google coder is talking about how hard her life is because she's a female coder. How exactly is this supposed to be helping again?
That's not, because that is when we're talking about when we're prioritizing a group identity and somebody's victimhood. That's the successor ideology.
That seems
spinning the wheels. Let's erode liberalism and do that's just the nonsense that's out there.
That seems to be the segue that you're going to talk about in SEL, right? So,
right, but I don't even know if
led right into that.
But I don't even know.
The original idea was just sort of people becoming more compassionate, so on down the line. Which, I mean, I don't know if that's a useful skill. I don't know if that's got it going on. The weak or the strong. But I mean, that's nonetheless a very useful, valuable thing. One most Americans would argue. But I think that where this is going, and what a lot of social scientists would have predicted, is that almost immediately that would be described as something like white supremacy with a smile, something along those lines.
Oh,
and you would move to add understanding of race, gender, the 87 different sexual orientations to SEL. And that's where we are now.
Right, but my point is that I don't even think this was there yet. I mean, and Jason can give us better examples of where that is going. My thing is, I think their point was, what I'm saying is, even without the gender and racial push, it's just going to be natural. While I'm teaching kids to get along, I'm going to say, you know, I'm just going to say, you know, regardless of the differences, like women, and I'm just going to throw in these things because I believe in, even if it's not part of an orchestrated SEL shift, the regular SEL done properly would still eventually have gone there anyway, because the people who are trying to make sure that these kids are, you know, talking about their confusion, talking about their feelings. Because I've had situations like that where he come home and told me what some kids say. I said, what? And I called teacher. Well, why did some kids say that? Well, that's what we do here. We just let the kids talk. Well, they're 6 and you're a moron.
No, you're absolutely right. And like I said, I started asking questions around 2017, 2018. So it was already happening in my department, and we were already training the teachers. We were already doing these ideas. It wasn't until when 2020, when Castle like officially changed it and did it. I mean, everybody, we were already doing it. Right. They just I guess legally and whatever
put it on the paperwork.
They just put it on the paperwork. But you're right. It gets things like that get through because of that teacher's lens. And right now, teachers, the lens that they're having is through this philosophical framework that views the individual as the source of injustice and the source of everything that's wrong with the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas my thinking of SEL is, how can we fortify the individual? How can we strengthen cross-group relationships? How can we tamp down those things within our human nature that are destructive, and how do we bring out those things in us that are great?
But okay, so talk a little bit about that connection, how the individual versus the collective, and what the shift that they did there.
But a complete shift. Like now, self-awareness includes your racial identity and gender identity, and I don't know what it means to like, okay, as a white, what is my identity? The oppressor? as what is a Black identity? What is an Asian identity? What are these different things? Nobody ever says. What is a woman? We can't even answer that basic question now, but people are supposed to identify in one of these check boxes. So what that does is it devalues the individual automatically. We've automatically devalued the individual, which strengthens our in-group bias. It strengthens the human capacity for prejudice, aggression, and cruelty. So we're building a society that we're eroding from the inside, essentially.
Right. And so are there, because basically the first question is, which group are you in? Right. It basically starts out with, first, before we do anything, we need to understand what group you're in. So let's put you in this, gender box, or in this race box, or some box, and then we go from there. And so you also talk about how this is like, I think I mentioned it, like one of the legs on the tripod of this, concerted push. So you got DEI. Talk about how SEL ties into DEI and anti-racism and all those kind of things.
Well, in my department, we were also tasked with doing equity work. And
that's the best work.
And that's what I've been told. And I know Austin has on the books, one of their goals through the National Equity Project is equal outcomes for all students.
Sounds about right.
And I asked, what does that mean? How do we get there without tyranny? And nobody had an answer for that.
Tyranny.
What we're doing is that we're advancing very radical ideas in our culture. Let's go back to our founding fathers. They put forth some really radical ideas in the 1700s, and it took a war. It took years of suffering. Maybe you could say it wasn't maybe until the 80s or 90s before that vision was actualized in society. Right now, we're doing the same thing with ideology that historically has always led to death. And we're doing it in Canada, we're doing it all through Europe. Every single Western democratized nation is utilizing this new philosophy.
But with a smile.
Under the guise of compassion. A lot of people think that, we're continuing the civil rights movement, and have no really idea that what they're doing is engaging in ideas and practices that are breaking down the individual, literally chipping away at the human spirit right now. Or utopia.
Go ahead, Will.
No, yeah. One thing that's interesting there is the kind of idea of compassionate control or compassionate dictatorship. That's something that I actually find really interesting as a political scientist. So I think in America, we've always kind of imagined that dictatorship would look like 1984. Like it's a jackboot stepping on a face forever, right? And in reality, it's turning out to look a little more like Brave New World, where Justin Trudeau, the former Playboy Prime Minister of Canada, stands up and looking like he's going to burst into tears, and sort of his notably soft face for a man says, we're going to ban 1,500 varieties of guns because how can we not? Just one life. And it seems like this sort of thing, if it's misused, can very much play into that. So you're 100%. Not understanding my lived Black experience. So we're going to have to lower your SEL score. And business is very real. Actually, it's your ESG score until you come to appreciate me. So we're seeing the exact opposite of what we've always thought tyranny would be. It's not, I'm going to whip your ass and take your land away from you. It's, well, unless someone wants to stand up and say that they are for, mass shootings or drunk driving or whatever the right is that's about to be taken away, we're all in agreement, aren't we, that we're all going to follow this system because it's anti-racist, it's empathic, it's pro-equity. These are the buzzwords we're all hearing in our different fields. And once you sign up for the system and you give your word of honor, and more importantly, your name on a contract, you have to do all this stupid shit, referring to the later version of SEL. And
Yeah.
if you break these rules, then there are very serious sanctions for it. I mean, last sentence for me, but in academia, we're now starting to do this with all sort of loyalty oaths, but cute loyalty oaths, where if you want to get promoted to the next level, if you want to get tenure, post-tenure review, this sort of thing, you have to sign a statement affirming your commitment to equity. In some cases, actually, your commitment to, it would be called something like SEL-linked processes, your commitment to full transgender inclusion. So you put that down, and then again, you've both given your word of honor and you signed a legal contract, you're going to have to do that. So anytime you say something that might be biologically accurate, for example, men aren't women, you can be called in, and your statements can be brought up, and you can be accused of violating this subtle process. So it's kind of like almost the dictatorship of the traditional mother, sort of. You don't want to say that, do you? That my Black and Jewish and so on buddies are very familiar with, but it's the government. It's not your loving mom. It's Justin Trudeau just wearing a fake smile. So this is very problematic. Any quick thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to expand that idea of compassionate dictatorship. I would like to expand that to that dictatorship right now is the entire culture, because those conversations that you just kind of went through, that's not just the government. Those things are happening in every single workplace.
Mhm.
I was stifled for years, because when I first started noticing, I was like, oh shit, everybody they'll be happy to know that this is the thing that's dividing us, and this thing is actually a political ideology that seeks to destroy your very well-being. But I lost friends. I lost a lot of things. I was actually pushed out of my job because the ideology was written into the job description, and I had to reapply or I was told I could reapply for that job. I would get it, but now the ideology was woven into my job description. So I said, I don't know what I'm going to eat or where I'm going to, but I can't do that. Mm-hmm. So the compassionate dictator, every single DEI bureaucracy, every single now SEL curriculum, every single social anti-racism way that it's currently being framed is through this ideology that seeks to erode the classical liberal society. And if people will disengage, and that's one thing that I'm really hoping to do, is impact the culture. Insert empowered humanity theory, those 6 ideas and practices, insert those in every single DEI, every single SEL, every single anti-racism work in the culture, because if we don't impact the culture now, that compassionate dictator is probably about 10 to 12 years old right now. Mm-hmm. The real tyrants are 10 to 12 years old that haven't seen human faces in a few years, that were locked in their rooms and in their houses for a few years. And now they're getting this ideology that these people are good, these people are bad. If you want power and status, you can say you're one of these people. So kids are the real dictator. Right now, it is that compassionate dictatorship moving its way through the culture. But once that idea works its way through the culture for 5 to 10 years, the real tyrants are 10 to 12 years old right now.
Yeah, the underlying ideas here actually aren't compassionate at all.
No.
To some extent. I mean, that the American system is institutionally oppressive. There are characteristics that are at least deep cultural, if not genetic, that whites, for example, have. I mean, all of this stuff is The term cultural Marxism is hotly debated, but at very least shares characteristics with a philosophy that killed 100 million people. So that's the thing to remember, that there are only so many human ideas. You know, NRX, the new hard right idea, is just monarchy. You know, this stuff, a compassionate, more socialist America, is just communism. There are only so many things that humans have conceived of over the years. So this strikes me as a set of extremely bad ideas that right now are being delivered to well-intentioned middle class, I think especially white people. I don't think Mayor Charles or Shamika is really going for this right now. But in this pleasant guise, and sooner or later that guise is going to fall down. You're going to see, you know, the fangs under the hood.
I wish that would be sooner than later. But it is. I had something on the tip of my tongue when you were talking, Will, but it escaped me.
Well, if it comes back to you, by all means mention. I want to ask you a question though, because a lot of it, you know, it's becoming more difficult, but a lot of my approach is to give people their argument because it's so weak. And if I assume that SEL is good, even in its current form, the problem is, I think I alluded to it earlier about, are these people even being trained properly to implement it? So I want to get your thoughts on this. At my kids' school, we had this meeting and they talked about the mission statement. They were so proud of this mission, which is clearly to treat everyone equally, right? That's their mission. Whatever, that's the number one goal on the top of the page. But then they went into this DEI, well, not really DEI, but anti-racism and these other things. And so they eventually get to the point that they tell me that myself and my son and, you know, Blacks are oppressed and that they want to have equity, not equality. I said, well, how are you going to do that and treat everyone equally? And then they just stared at the screen and they looked at each other and they nodded and it was quiet. So
that's the clash of the classic liberalism and the successor ideology.
Right. But because no one ever challenges them, they don't have to think about it. But when I asked that simple question, they thought about it. They couldn't really come up with a response. So I wonder, from your experience, do you think that many of them realize that their work is futile because they can't do both? They can't treat everyone the same. Now, some of them, the radicals, are openly saying, down with Whitey. But I mean, some of them was the true compassionate people, like, I just want everybody to be treated nicely. And then they're like, let's punch the white people in the face so we can help the Black people. But I thought you want to treat everybody nicely. Well, I do, but it's hard to treat the Blacks nicely and the whites nicely without punching the white people in the face. So I have to prioritize who I want to treat more nicely or treat nicely first, or whatever the case may be. But I don't think they realize it. Do you think they realize it?
I don't think they realize it at all. And what I think is that even though they're advancing essentially neo-Marxist ideas, and Will, I remember what it was, we can go back to, it was that cultural Marxism thing. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them, but then again, I've had people tell me, you know, I think I get triggered when you say Marxism because I realize I'm on that side. Mm-hmm. Like, people, and I've had people completely bury their heads and ignore me, like friends, when I ask, like, we need to talk about this, not because I'm trying to be right about something, but because I see a historically deadly train moving fast down the tracks. And I think all of us right now, it would benefit everybody if we could question those practices, because that, like the people that were kind of stumped by your question, a good follow-up question would be, what is your belief of the individual? Is the individual something that's worthy, or do we need to break it down? And if you think it's worthy, then we're all treated equally. Like, that's that classical liberal idea. If we're not treating each other equally, then let us know who do we treat better and how. Like, right. Like list out, you know, make people list out, like, what's the pecking order? What's the intersectional new tribal pecking order that we're supposed to do, and how am I supposed to behave?
But you know, Jason, one of the problems is, you talk about burying their heads in the sand. It's 2 years later shocking. I wasn't shocked at first, but 2 years later, there's still people who just say it doesn't happen. that, that's either right-wing propaganda or that's a
Right.
one-off, right? You got to send them
Right.
97 examples. I just had something yesterday or something on Twitter, but somebody's talking about something about some news story about treating blacks different, giving them a special type of whatever. And they said, oh, I don't know, that story doesn't read, something about that story doesn't seem true. And I don't like the source. And I heard that source is not really, it's kind of like propaganda. And then everybody's debating it. And I just said, okay, because there's so many examples. What do you think of this story? Because this is the same thing. This is from NBC News. So I went back to the San Diego Unified Schools saying they're going to stop, penalizing students, Black and Hispanic students for being tardy, and they're going to change the grading system. And it's like, oh, that's bad. So you believe that because it's NBC, but you don't believe this other story. It's the exact same type of story, only it's not from NBC.
Yeah.
But that's what I get. I get people saying, well, that would be bad if that was really happening, but that's just Fox News talking point. It's not really happening.
But it
Maybe
is,
there's one place somewhere in the country, but it's not really happening.
I was in a meeting in, I don't know, 2018 or so, and we were talking about all of the white supremacist policies that our school district had. And I was kind of I was like, wow. I was like, where are these policies and whose office can I go knock on? Because this is ridiculous. There is no way in 2017 that we should have white supremacist policies on file. What are they? And nobody ever, they couldn't point to what the white supremacist policies are. But I'll say it's this cultural Marxism that's there. And I know that's kind of a spicy term, but if you look at the Frankfurt School, if you look at Marcuse, who decided like, hey, what we need to do is divide society up into multiple oppressed groups against a single oppressor, because the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, just one versus one didn't work. And then if they can continually divide, if the groups will continuously on their own divide, and we're seeing that with the rainbow flag. Like it used to be 1 or 2 letters. Now it's like 28 letters. And one of the things now is anything right of the B is straight people cosplaying.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, we are in this never-ending, perpetual human clashing, and there is no inclusion, there is no compassion, hell, there is no truth. It's just a bunch of nihilistic, cynical people going at each other until the liberal order ultimately implodes on itself.
They're doing the same thing with DEI. They've added 2 letters to that already now, right? So I was talking to somebody like DEI. I was like, no, it's DEIB now. It has belonging. And then the next time it was something else after. It's an A. It's like, I forgot, do any of you know what the A is? Now it's DEIBA.
Yeah, the A is acceptance. So this, I think, this actually gets into something that's really my most recent article. I'll avoid the blatant plug, but I mean, that's characteristic of a lot of these movements, which is the idea of shared oppression. And this is why when you go to a pride parade, you see these signs that make no sense, like Queers for an Islamic Palestine. The idea is that everyone's being held back by the same group of like 22 white upper class men in bespoke suits. So there is this attempt to unify everything. And that's why, I don't want to ramble on, but you have a black stripe in the pride flag. It's called the Progress Pride flag. You even have a brown stripe for Hispanics and Muslims. And I mean, that's one of my
I saw the Ukrainian colors at the end one time.
Oh, that's hilarious if that's true. I haven't seen that one.
I saw one of those.
Really? Okay,
yes.
that's absurd. That's just ridiculous. But like when you look at those groups, like I love my black brothers and sisters, Hispanics, Muslims, no problem with them. But when you look at the least homophobic groups in the country, you don't include Muslim Arabs on that list or Ukrainians. It just doesn't make any sense to say like we're here writing for gays, hood black people, Muslims, and Ukrainians. There's no shared, many of those people are fighting each other right now. There's no shared unity that those groups have. But the attempt to forge one together is what you're seeing right now. And again, to return to my actually rather serious point, the problem with this is that it requires an enemy. And I think, looking at Jason, I think we know who a lot of these people are going to try to make that enemy out to be, sort of the traditional majority population of the USA, Christians, whites, whatever it is.
I'm all of the bad things.
You're a white Christian guy, middle class at least. What else?
Straight, cisgender, able-bodied, native-born, not hideously
Shamika
ugly.
Thin.
Habla usted español?
Un poquito,
Don't really speak a foreign language. I mean, this guy, you just gotta get a rope. That's what I'm saying. But no, I mean, it's the whole idea of this. That really is the problem with this. Of course, is that probably 300% of the population falls into some oppressed group. Like, after the publication of this next book, I'll actually be upper class, but I'm Black. I'm technically in a relationship with a queer person. I live in the South, just on and on and on. I could claim these oppressed categories. Now, in reality, only money and IQ and appearance, a few other things actually matter these days, but nonetheless, it's easy to do.
Well, I always said that from these group standpoint for the last 3 or 4 years when they first started pushing this intersectionality thing, I'm like, that's a great thing for the people who are opposing this. We should be using this as a weapon, right? Because we have human nature on our side, and we know, like Will said, that all these groups either really don't have that many things in common or will eventually fall apart. So even though it sounded bad and all the people center right and right Republicans were all like afraid, like, oh no, that these groups are going to get together and all these people are going to be strengthened and they're going to unify against us. No, they're not. Because if you got them in the room for more than 20 minutes, by the time the coffee got warm, they'd be at each other's throats. And not even because of the homophobia in certain groups, it would be a hierarchy, right? The Blacks would be upset with other groups because I was like, yeah, we all need to do this, but our thing needs to come first because we've been oppressed longer. Yeah, but our oppression was worse and more of us better. But then you could walk in the room, the straight white man would open the door and peek in and be like, wait a minute. We thought that we were looking in thinking that they were all going to be sharpening weapons to attack us, and they're all at each other's throat. So the intersectionality would fall apart, but nobody really paid attention to it. They just, and they're still spinning it, but they don't believe it. They really don't believe that all these people have these things in common and will march down the lane in one unified force and never break up. It's crazy.
Well, but are we being divided to be conquered? Is that because no matter what oppressed group you're in or your future children or future unborn grandchildren will be in, if this thing is successful, it don't matter. Nobody's going to have any autonomy because the whole goal is to remove personal autonomy and to remove sovereignty and to conquer that thing within human beings that makes us want to live our life and pursue our own interest and think our own thoughts. Just that whole essence of being human is being deliberately attacked right now.
Well, so let's finish up by talking about what we do about it, how we push back against it, talk about your work and what you're doing and, this uphill battle and see if we can change anything.
So what I'm hoping to do, and my thought partner is Eric Smith. So I'll say what we are hoping to do is really impact the culture. If we don't change the ideas and the attitudes in the culture right now, remember that 10, 12-year-old tyrant that I talked about? If we can begin to impact the culture now, then that will soften up, and those kids will understand valuing the individual. So really the impacting the culture through social and emotional learning, through DEI, through anti-racism. Eric and I are also, we're putting on a workshop this summer called Fourth Wave Anti-Racism. And that's one of the movements that we're going to really be doing, is to completely elevate and bypass what Kendi and what everybody is talking about anti-racism now, because it's cultivating racism. When we strengthen that in-group, when we strengthen our in-group bias, we all have that in-group bias preference. When we strengthen the capacity for prejudice, aggression, and cruelty, that's where racism comes from. So Kendi's message and everybody that's doing this anti-racism work right now, they're actually psychologically strengthening racism in the minds and in the hearts of people. So we are looking to intercept those things through educator training, through corporate trainings. And then also we have another event where Eric and I are going to give a talk, give a lecture. And then after that, we have a psychedelic hip hop band, Cadillac Music, that is going to perform to kind of have this just big celebration and really get something else going in our culture. So we've got a couple of different events. We do hope to replicate those across the country and engage schools, engage businesses, engage communities that don't want destructive ideological practices tearing up their communities anymore, and that are ready to come together and unite for everything that is good for the sake of our species.
Shamika, any final thoughts from you on any of this?
I think this is just very disturbing to me. I don't know how I feel about SEI. I'm not really sure. Like, I think bullying is good. So, and that's even for me. Like, I was bullied in the 5th grade, and I feel like I am able to walk through life because I actually had to deal with that head on and learn how to handle people not liking you for whatever reason. And it's almost like we're kind of taking that from kids to be able to learn how to deal with life. I just don't know. Like, I do know kids are maybe meaner, you know, they don't just throw hands, they carry guns or knives or whatever. I don't know how I feel about the whole make everybody nice. I feel like it's not a good thing. And I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it.
Well, are the kids really meaner though, or are they just able to send their meanness out to more people now because of social media?
Yeah,
I don't think they're meaner.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, because I know me and my friends were when we were little, and I don't see these people bullying, what they call bullying now, anywhere near what we did.
Yeah,
Well,
and we made it.
I will say that about our kids meaner. I'm going to be working with the district in Maryland next year, and I was talking with the school leader today, and they specifically mentioned an uptick in aggression and aggressive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the systemic dehumanization that we've done. So the work that I'm going to do with them is to work on rehumanizing our system and rehumanizing our classrooms. And I don't necessarily know if it's about make everybody be nice, because some moments aren't called for being nice, you know. But then again, how can I maintain my dignity, and how can I maintain the dignity of somebody else in conflict if I have to? You know, how can I just say this isn't worth it, I'm going to walk away, versus I'm going to lose control of myself and just punch them in the face. So
how did we learn that? So I guess that's maybe my question. Like, for someone like myself that was in school long time ago,
Long.
how did my generation learn that without an actual class for it?
That's if the SEL teacher agrees with me.
That's a good question.
I say that being bullied, like Shamika saying, being bullied, that part of it, she says it helped her strengthen her character and be able to put up with it, right? Part of it, but it also gave her a little voice to not, fat people excluded, to not treat other people that same way. So I know how that feels. So I don't want to treat anybody else that way. So it kind of creates puts you in a situation where you don't do that to others because you've been told not to do it, but now you really feel it. You've been there. I know what it's like, so I'm not going to do that to you.
And I'll go back to our generation. You know what? Maybe I was 70s, 80s, graduated in the 90s, but
that's a lot of decades, by the way. But okay.
Back in the 80s and 90s,
90s,
our culture, those classical liberal values were still in our culture. We were getting those ideas. We were getting ideas like treat people how you want to be treated. We knew things like the golden rule and work hard and pull your, all of those things were part of, they were just in the culture. So
Right.
we picked up on them. Now, those things aren't in the culture. Like
Okay.
there is nothing in the culture that is strengthening and fortifying the individual so that they know how to respond and how to
That
get
is
up.
a phenomenal response.
Okay.
Because even like you can be an atheist or non-religious, but if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you still know scripture because it was everywhere. You still know that kind of stuff. Where now, if you're not religious, you have no way of knowing it, right? Because you have to go out and specifically seek it, right? So it's the same thing as the culture being where this is what you're supposed to do, right? Commercials used to tell you this is what you're supposed to do. Now, some people believe it was too heavy-handed, but at least it was out there. It was enough of it out there that you could find it. And now it's more like, who am I to say, do whatever you want to do.
There's no truth, moral relativism, nihilistic, cynical, constantly tearing down. Truth, beauty, and goodness are bad. All of the values, all of the things that made us who we are, and think the way we want to be treated. Now, all of those things are taught as white supremacy and whiteness.
And you said truth. And lastly, you said truth, goodness, and beauty are bad. They're not bad. They're just subjective. So we get to decide what it is. So you say something is true, but if I don't think it's true, then it's not really true. We all get to pick what truth is, pick what the goodness is, and pick all these things. And it's whatever the collective says it is.
Well, the only truth, capital T truth, is that there is no truth. Yeah. And so how in the hell is a society that can't even define simple, basic truths?
Like what's a woman?
And they're in a constant destruction mode. How is that society going to thrive?
I'll leave on this. There are 4 people on this panel. How many women are on the panel? How do you know? Who else says 1? Oh, 1, huh? I don't think we really know. I think we need to get a little bit more information first. I get it. So, well, Jason, that is probably, so hopefully that answers your question, Shamika. It's a cultural problem probably, but Jason, thank you for your time and your insights and your education on SEL. And I hope we and the listeners and viewers learned a lot about it. I still don't know, like Shamika, if it was the best thing to do, but whatever it was, we know they have completely broken it now, and it's terrible. And we need to do more of what you're doing. He is Jason Littlefield. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
I was going to say it's not just terrible. It is putting forth an idea that every individual is not worthy, and the individual is not of value, and that's an idea we have to get out of our culture.
Will, last word.
Actually, if I can do my final comment. Basically, I totally agree with Jason, but in one sentence, I think teachers, I agree with Shamika and Charles, you as well. I think teachers are taking on far too many roles in general. I mean, this to me is the thread that runs through all this. I mean, when you guys were saying things, now I, of course, am a youth, easily the youngest member of the panel, barely out of college, 29 maybe. But I mean, like, in all seriousness, though, when people are saying, like, you learned how to do certain things, like they're genderqueer, for example, there's a book on oral sex in a lot of middle school libraries. Most people kind of figured that out on their own. I mean, you had a slightly older girlfriend. It's really, you're not going to ask your teacher. You know, you can make both sides of the case, but we all got around to doing it. It maybe took another year or two, which isn't a bad thing. How to fist fight. I mean, so when teachers are explaining these things, how physical self-defense, how to be kind, how to have sex to students, I think most people feel that they're wildly crossing the line. And I agree with that. I think they have a basic job, which is teaching chemistry or whatnot. Go in and do it. Right. That's my one take on that.
But that chemistry is race-based chemistry with the cultural approach that would understand the way Blacks learn that chemistry.
It was all invented in Egypt.
Well, is it maybe chemistry is just white supremacist and we don't need to teach it at all?
Yeah, we really just need, but I mean, this actually, like, I don't want to drag us on any longer. I think we're all enjoying the conversation, but like, there's a school in South Africa that's actually teaching witchcraft now. It sounds like a joke, but you guys can Google this. The idea was that science is white supremacist, and a couple of upper class Black students said this, and the teacher was like, well, what do you want to teach instead? And it turned out that they were descendants of tribal chiefs and witch doctors, or whatever the appropriate terms are. So their comment was, well, we want to teach traditional Zulu magic. And so now you can take courses in that. So this is kind of a which way Western man kind of thing,
Wow.
right? Is it wizardry or is it science?
Wow.
I don't think anyone can top that. He is Jason Littlefield, Executive Director of Empowered Pathways and co-founder of Free Black Thought. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Thank y'all so much. Appreciate it.
To say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.